hopefully we can move this needle forward and see the benefits of this money that the federal government is providing to local jurisdictions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the team from PFM to introduce themselves and to begin the presentation. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon and thank you very much. It's great to see everybody today. Hope you can hear me fine. And my name is Stephen Alexander with PFM, and I want to thank Randy Sherman for inviting us today. We have a very full agenda, as gentleman just said, about 97 pages long. But our team is going to work hard to get through those 90 pages, but hopefully, more importantly, this information will be very informative and impactful to you regarding this very complicated topic. So we will take just a second here to introduce the team that I brought here today to you from PFM. These are folks that specialize in reviewing financial planning and consulting on various budget topics, as well as this very important topic today. So today's program is entitled Practical Ideas for the American Rescue Plan Act Implementation, What the New Treasury Guidelines Means to You. And today our two presenters that will be walking us through this presentation, we're going to start off with Danielle Scott and also Ryan McNeely are our two presenters today, and we'll start through this presentation. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to chat, or there's maybe some mechanism. We'll have a few pauses here and there if you want to shout out a question, but we want this program to be as helpful as possible to you. Like I said, it's a very complicated topic. It's very new to all of us. So hopefully today we will give you some good guidance on the Act. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Danielle. Danielle, please.
Thanks, Steve. Ryan, do you want to take us through the first couple of overview and goals of the American Rescue Plan Act in our presentation today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Danielle. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ryan McNeely. I'm a director with PFM's Management Budget Consulting Practice. I am based out of our New Orleans office, so not too far away from you all. Similar weather that we're having over here. We're watching the Gulf closely. Daniel, you can go to the next slide. I'm gonna give a brief overview and move pretty quickly through these slides because there's a lot to get through, and Danielle is really the expert on all things ARPA, and I know that's why you all are here today. So this is a lot of words, but I think the key takeaway from this slide is there is hope, right? So everybody has had a very difficult year and a half really at this point, but things are looking up pretty much no matter how you look at it. Case rates are down, vaccination rates are up. And with the passage of the ARP, relief is finally coming to local governments. And I know that's what you all are interested in. There are a lot of things that have changed in the past year and a half. Work from home is that could have lasting impacts on local economies, and it's unclear exactly how that's going to shake out. But the purpose of the presentation today is to give everybody some tools in order to better leverage the funding that they have received to grow your economy and develop a more inclusive economy. And that's contemplated in the legislation, and that's what we're here to help with today. The new normal of where we're going to end up is still relatively speculative. It's unclear exactly how sort of commercial real estate is going to rebound, and there's all sorts of economic indicators moving in different directions. So it's unclear exactly where we're going to end up, but this funding can really help sort of bridge the uncertainty that we're going to be facing over the next 6 months or a year or several years. This content is based on the legislation itself and Treasury guidance, but as I'm sure you all are aware that there's guidance that is ever changing. It seems like every week we get an update to the FAQs. So this is obviously all in flux, but we have a pretty good sense of the broad contours of where we're going to end up. This is focused on you all general governments at the local level, but I think it's broadly applicable to other sectors. And our goal today is to just give you some thoughts about our understanding of the legislation and the regulations and the rules, and basically just validate all of the hard work that you're all already engaged in for your communities, and trying to figure out some of those calculations that Danielle is going to talk about a little bit later. You can go to the next slide, Danielle. All right, so this recession was a bit different than others in the past, right? So this is not like the Great Recession that was caused by excess supply in the housing market. This is a contraction in the services sector. The bad news is that causes a very sharp loss of employment. Florida has a very robust tourism economy. As I mentioned, I'm based out of New Orleans, which also has a very robust tourism economy. And so certain areas were disproportionately hurt by the sectors that were affected during the recession. The good news is, though, that there's no glut of inventory that needs to be absorbed. So the recovery from this type of recession can actually be a sharp recovery or a sharper recovery than what we had seen in the previous recession. On the next slide, Danielle, that's actually borne out in the data. There was a very sharp drop in multiple economic indicators, whether it's employment or GDP or what have you, and then also a sharp recovery. We can go to the next slide. Florida is growing in population. Not everywhere in the U.S. is growing. And this is going to be important as we talk about how to leverage some of these dollars for infrastructure projects, because many localities in Florida are going to have to contemplate growth and the infrastructure needs that are associated with that. Go to the next slide. So this data is from Q1, where there were significant job losses, but also about a 50% recovery. I think I read this morning that the June jobs report came out and 850,000 jobs were gained nationwide, which is pretty robust. So it seems like the economy is really back on track, and the growth, the recovery is aligned with the projections from the federal government. Florida in particular is also having a rebound, even sort of before the tourism industry is fully back. Major revenue categories are up significantly from their low points last year. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty here. So the federal government has taken a number of actions in the past year to help folks recover from the pandemic. This is really bookended by two separate, approximately $2 trillion bills passed approximately 1 year apart. So in March 2020, the CARES Act, and you all are probably still dealing with some of the issues from the CARES Act and the reporting requirements and everything that comes with that. And then, of course, the basis of our presentation today, the ARP, another approximately $2 trillion. And this is the one that actually had a significant portion dedicated to relief for state and local governments. And so that's why we're going to walk through some of the details. If you take a look at sort of this color scheme here, the upper left corner, I will say, the orange and the salmon and the gray colors, that's really direct relief to individuals, right? So folks got stimulus checks. There was extended unemployment benefits with a bonus payment from the federal government that's being phased out over the summer, expanded tax credits. In the lower left is really the heart of the relief for state and local governments, $350 billion in fiscal recovery funds. And we're going to talk more about that, of course, throughout the presentation. But I don't want to lose sight of sort of the lower right, which is smaller dollar amounts spread across different sort of service areas and sectors. But when you add it all up, it's actually, about the same size or even more as the direct relief from state and local fiscal recovery. So here's sort of an overview of the history here and the rules. So in May, we got initial guidance from the interim final rule, or IFR. Treasury did sort of give the broad contours of what local governments could expect in terms of timing of funding and what needs to be done with it. The IFR has eligible uses and ineligible uses, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and then Danielle will go into even more detail. But it's still, there are areas that are subject to interpretation. I would even claim that they're still ambiguous. And I know that Treasury is working on further guidance. The rule is not final. It's an interim rule. And so if you, as a local government or just as a member of the public, have comments or feedback on the rule, so the federal government is accepting those comments until July 16th of this year, and then the rule will be finalized. So how can these fiscal recovery funds be used, right? So you can use them to respond to the pandemic and its negative economic impacts. That is defined relatively broadly, and of course, we'll get into more detail there. Essential workers, providing premium pay, provide government services across a broad range to the extent of the reduction in revenue. And so there's a complicated revenue loss calculation that goes into that bucket that Danielle will talk about in a little bit. And to make necessary investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Those are the three categories that are enumerated in the legislation itself, but those can be relatively broadly defined. And again, that'll be discussed a little bit later. What you can't do is simply use the funds to cut taxes. That's kind of what that bullet one there says in a simple way. There's additional guidance that speaks a little bit more about this, but the intent of the legislation was that you could not just take the money and then cut taxes by an equivalent amount, nor could you use the funds to offset a legacy pension liability and simply deposit the money into a pension fund. Other than that, these four categories above for eligible uses, the goal, I think the intent is to define them relatively broadly. And I think that local governments are working towards that and making sure that the final rules preserve as much eligibility as possible. Timing, right? So there's different timing for the different sizes of local governments. Some states qualify for a large single payment based on an elevated employment rate. Other states will be getting it in two tranches. Large counties and cities will also be getting it in two tranches a year apart. The U.S. territories will get a single payment. It just really depends on what your local government unit is here. For non-entitlement units or smaller local governments, which probably is the majority of people in the room right now, you are at the mercy of the state of Florida. However, the state is required to disperse your funds within 30 days upon their receipt of the funds, right? So the federal government did sort of, give a directive at that point that when they transfer the funds to the state has 30 days to turn it around. I'll just give a little bit of a timeline here. So just covering the history, the fiscal recovery funds, the plan was signed into law on March 11th. They can be used to cover funds basically starting from around that point, a week or so before the legislation was passed. Again, there's a deadline for comments. The funds must be obligated by the end of 2024, not spent, obligated. So you basically just need to figure out what you're going to be using the funds for. And then the funds must be spent by December 31 of 2026. So on the one hand, right, this is a lot of time because the funds don't actually need to be spent for about 5 years or so. On the other hand, it's a lot of money for many local governments. And so that's why we want to emphasize later in the presentation how important it is to plan. This is a multi-year period. It's intended to be a multi-year program. So on the one hand, you don't want to sort of just kind of wait around, right, and lose the opportunity to spend the dollars at the end of the period. On the other hand, you may not want to spend it all at once and then leave yourself in a situation.
Hey, can you remind me, is Camino Real east of the bridge to A1A County?
Yes.
Somebody came off there.
East of the bridge.
East of the bridge.
Chrissy, if we could ask you to mute your phone, Chrissy.
I don't know the answer.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chrissy. All right, Ryan, go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, good. Danielle, you can go to the next slide. So we're going to quiz everybody on these categories at the end. Just kidding. This is a lot of information. There's a lot in this legislation, right? I hope that this presentation will be provided to everyone because this is a lot of different resources here about all of these different buckets. And as I said earlier, it's not just the fiscal recovery funds. There's a lot of other potential dollars out there to leverage in all of these different areas, particularly in housing and education. And so this is going to be a collaborative enterprise with all of the funds that are flowing into communities and not just coming directly to the local government. Same thing on the next slide, Danielle. Health and human services, there's over $100 billion going to those sectors, and those really should be partnered with the fiscal recovery funds to maximize their impact. Eligible and ineligible capital. So we talked a little bit about the operating before, and I'll try to move quickly through this. So again, water, sewer, and broadband, affordable housing, public health, and assistance to impacted industries, which of course is mostly tourism. What you can't do is do infrastructure projects that are completely unrelated to the pandemic or to build affordable housing outside of a qualified census tract. The legislation is designed so you can also, you can't just sit on the money and develop sort of a capital rainy day fund. You actually do need to obligate and ultimately spend the money. You can't defease debt or use it to pay existing debt service or use it to pay settlements or judgments that are already on the books. Another timeline here. So basically the outlook for state and local governments before the ARP Act passed was pretty dire. All three rating agencies had adjusted their outlook from stable to negative. Pretty much immediately upon passage of the bill, and once folks got an understanding of the full magnitude of the state and local fiscal recovery funds, all of the rating agencies moved in tandem to revise their outlook from negative to stable. Moody's on literally the day it was passed, and then S&P, Fitch, and then at the end, you can see in May, when the cash was starting to be distributed to large local governments, Moody's said that these infusions, they're looking at a credit positive scenario going forward. So it's a lot of money, and it really is designed to fill the entire gap left by the recession for state and local governments and more. And so the rating agencies have sort of recognized that fact. All right, now that I gave sort of the history there, Danielle is going to provide some additional information on what you should do with this money and how you can act strategically. Danielle.
Thank you, Ryan, and hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with y'all. I'm based in New Orleans like Ryan is, but I actually grew up a little bit in Lake Worth, so I went to elementary school locally, so I feel like really excited to, very full circle, to be presenting back to some hometown folks. So I'm going to talk through some of the strategic budget considerations that you should be thinking about. There are good problems to have when it comes to thinking about the American Rescue Plan Act. There's significant near-term payments to provide immediate relief. You've got a great funding threshold over the next 4 to 5 fiscal years, as Ryan mentioned. When it comes to spending the funds, the federal goals for these programs really are based in, there's a strong emphasis on equity as well as recovery, and a lot of opportunity for municipalities to support, the folks who are really, the folks and the industries really hit hardest, while also allowing each of the municipalities to make really broad decisions around what makes the most sense for their local government. The challenge being that there's a lot of pressure to spend too much too soon, and there's this tension around being urgent long-term needs versus a dependence on funding. So thinking about a multi-year approach for these funds, knowing that, they will end, the funds will stop by 2026. So making sure that new programs that have, costs associated with these programs long beyond 2026 have appropriate costs and funding sources to support them going forward. And, there's a need to build this consensus and to create clarity around local equity goals and metrics. And I'll talk about this in a little bit later. So it's a little bit of invest now or wait. How am I supposed to move in this direction? What should my next steps be? And while also sort of balancing this emergent need to fill any known structural deficits that you have now, pay back folks who have, provided a lot of service during the pandemic and provide premium pay. So balancing all of those needs is really at the forefront. And we're going to talk throughout this presentation about how you can approach those decisions and how to tackle some of those challenges that we just outlined. So you want to think about these over a multi-year framework. So starting by estimating the amount of available revenue loss replacement dollars. So if you're thinking about the, your total allocation for your municipality, the most flexible of those dollars are going to be the revenue replacement dollars that are defined via the revenue loss calculation. And we'll talk in detail about how to do that calculation in just a second. But those dollars associated with that revenue loss calculation can be used for funding of the provision of government services and determine how, and those government service dollars are really give you the most flexibility to use them on key items for public safety or for infrastructure or for, shoring up a budget deficit versus paying other folks. And then the next piece, as you're thinking about that multi-year framework, after you've sort of identified your revenue loss replacement dollars and what that bucket of funds are out of your allocation, is to then go through each of the other individual sort of buckets of funding that the interim final rule has outlined. And that's providing public health response, supporting economic recovery and growth, investing in infrastructure, as well as investing in equitable priorities. And we'll touch on each of these in much more detail shortly. But doing so, both of those approaches, while also keeping in mind how to maximize the impact of the many other funding sources that Ryan had on one of his earlier slides, can be really tricky. And to do so in an efficient and effective way, you want to think about it over a multi-year approach, taking certain steps one by one in order to make sure that you're maximizing your allocation, you're leveraging these once in a lifetime, once in a generation dollars that are being put in front of us, while also, making key investments in things you need, but also things that priorities that you have that you may not otherwise be able to make an investment with had it not be for these funds. So some key steps around quantifying around this multi-year program really include quantifying the immediate public health needs. So understanding what costs are going to be or that you have around upcoming vaccine rollouts, ongoing testing and PPE needs, estimating the amount of revenue loss replacement to determine the amount eligible to use towards the spending category, as well as all the other spending categories important, because like I said, that revenue loss replacement has the fewest restrictions when used for the provision of government services. And thinking about how these funds can really help to alleviate relief within your communities is a key one, and is one that's emphasized particularly in the reporting for the fiscal recovery funds that we'll touch on shortly. But for analysis such as above, you want to think about mapping out how much of the total flexible funds remains available going forward on a year-to-year basis. You also want to develop a multi-year baseline forecast prior to layering in your direct ARP allocation and associated spending. So think about at a minimum a 5-year horizon that includes the 1-year ARP Act fiscal recovery funds, and that also reevaluates non-ARP Act baseline revenue forecasts in light of stimulus impacts on local households as well as businesses, and just the general economic recovery and rebound within your particular municipalities. And this type of approach is really important when thinking about the revenue loss calculation in particular. And we'll talk about that why in just a second, but if you're thinking about how these revenue dollars are going to be spent and how the calculation is put forth, there's a key assumption around, doing the calculation for each of the different fiscal years. And if your municipality has a much stronger revenue recovery than anticipated, then that could have an adjustment on how much flexible dollars you have at your disposal via the guidance. And so to the extent that ARP Act funds remain available after most must spending occurs, you want to be clear about eligible and ineligible uses, develop that menu of options, as well as prioritize options, and develop a strategy for what to fund and when across the planning horizon. So let's talk a little bit more about the revenue loss replacement, since that's such a core piece around, a first step around thinking about and applying the revenue replacement dollars and the fiscal recovery funds. So when you're thinking about this multi-year approach, that first step is to do the revenue loss replacement calculation. And like I said, that revenue loss replacement calculation allows you the most flexibility to use those funds dictated based on that calculation on government services. So that could include anything from maintenance or pay-go funding for building infrastructure, including roads, including the modernization of cybersecurity, hardware, and critical infrastructure, health services, environmental remediation, school and education services, as well as the provision of public safety, including police, fire, and EMS. Those government services, as Ryan sort of touched on earlier, does not include any type of principal or spending on interest or debt, short-term revenue or tax anticipation notes, replenishing fiscal reserves. So this is a big one. You're not allowed to use those revenue replacement dollars to shore up your rainy day fund. And that's a very specific and sort of clear rule according to the guidance, as well as the satisfaction of any settlement agreement or consent decrees. So to calculate the revenue loss, what you're going to do is, to the extent that you can demonstrate what that revenue loss is, you're going to go through, it's a 4-step process that's outlined in 2 slides here, but recipients can either use this 4.1% per year factor for growth, or an assumption for what growth would have been over the course of the pandemic, or you can use it the 3-year average of growth from the 3 full fiscal years prior to COVID-19. So for most, that's fiscal years 2016 to 2019. And then in calculating that revenue loss, you're going to then take sort of the aggregate of what that loss is, and then subtract it from your actual revenue, and then to see what that portion is of your revenue loss. And so you're going to have to do, as I said, those calculations for each of the fiscal years associated with the fiscal recovery funds. And you will talk about a little bit more later some of the nuances of that calculation. But general revenue is sort of the first start in thinking about how to do that calculation. So how the interim final rule and U.S. Treasury sort of define what falls into this general revenue category is any revenue, regardless of if it's just in your general fund or in your convention center fund or other ancillary funds, including special revenue. And you want to think about, as long as these revenues are not correcting transactions, are not proceeds from the issuance of debt, are not generated by your utilities or from insurance trust funds, and are not intergovernmental transfers from the federal government, then they would theoretically be included in your calculation. And I want to emphasize this because this is a step that has been causing some confusion amongst our clients and just nationally. And it hasn't been clear that general revenue doesn't just mean your general fund. It really does mean sort of all governmental services and each of the different revenues from your various funds that you have within your municipality. Including tax revenue, charges for services. It's sort of all encompassing into that calculation. So to do the calculation, we've got outlined the 4 steps here based on the guidance. So like I said, you take first you identify your base year and estimate the revenues in the most recent fiscal year. So for most, this would be fiscal year 2019, and that's would be your base year. And from that base year, you take the counterfactual revenue, which is either that 4.1% or the 3-year average of the growth from FY16 to FY 2019, plug that into that calculation there. And then in order to identify your actual revenue, you would take whatever that is over the past 12 months, usually right around fiscal year 2020 would be the first year of actuals that most clients I've been working with have. And then from there, you would take the counterfactual revenue from step 2 minus the actual revenue from step 3, and that number is your revenue loss. So if you have a $50 million allocation from the American Rescue Plan Act for fiscal recovery funds, and the calculation asserts that you have 25 million associated with revenue loss, then that means 25 million of those dollars can be used broadly on any provision of government services, while the other $25 million associated that are not sort of outlined from your revenue loss, revenue replacement calculation can be used on any of the other buckets, including broadband infrastructure, water infrastructure, public health, or the improvement of economic impact or equity. So on this slide, it sort of demonstrates that counterfactual scenario that we just talked about. So the growth adjustment is defined in this one as 4.1%, and the recipient's average annual revenue growth over the 3 full fiscal years prior to COVID-19. And so in this example, the average revenue growth from 16 to 19 was lower than 4.1%. Therefore, the counterfactual revenue grows by 4.1% annually, and the difference between that counterfactual and the actual revenue is the maximum amount the recipient can use towards revenue replacement, which is the items in that green section of this graph. In the second example, the recipient's annual average revenue growth from 16 to 19 was much higher than 4.1%, closer to 5%. And so the extent of revenue reduction was equal to the counterfactual revenue minus the actual revenue in some cases. So because the actual revenue actually exceeded the counterfactual when the calculation was done in 2022 and 2023 in this example, the revenue loss reduction is set at 0 for those 2 years. So I want to highlight a couple of issues and nuances with the calculation themselves. And some of this has been a topic if you've been updating the FAQ document that Treasury puts out on a twice daily basis, as I do, just to make sure you're staying on top of all of the guidance that comes about. There's definitely some kinks in the calculation itself. And so one of those being that actual revenues are defined as revenues calculated over the past 12 months of the calculation. So as of December 31st of each year. So as a result of this, the actual revenue calculation is a little bit more complex since oftentimes it does not follow most municipalities' fiscal year and does not necessarily, since most municipalities do not have a calendar year-based fiscal year. Another question that came about that was recently responded to in the Treasury FAQ was this question around whether the funds had to be used audited or unaudited actuals. And Treasury recently came out and said that the revenue calculation does not have to include audited actuals, which is good because it allows folks to be a little bit more, to actually immediately start getting at this calculation without having to worry about an off-cycle audit for 3 months or 4 months or however many months you're off the calendar year cycle. But either way, prospective periods can only be projected and are not yet known. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, one of the benefits of having sort of an out-year projection of all of your revenues over the next 5 years is so that you can have an understanding of where you're going to end up from a revenue loss perspective in 2023, 2024, and onward, given that you have to redo the calculation each year. So in the event that more favorable actual results or revenue rebound is much higher later on, you could actually it could actually decrease your amount that you have for revenue loss in the long run. And that way means you would have to reallocate potentially dollars and projects that you had plugged in for a more general government services into some of the more specific uses in the other funding categories. So I'm going to pause here because this is a lot of nuance and see if there are any questions in the chat or in the audience, and I'd be happy to respond to a couple now, and then I'll keep going into the questions, digging into the eligible and ineligible uses.
Any questions for Danielle? So far, no questions in the chat. Anybody in the audience? Okay, hearing none, let's continue.
All righty. Feel free to drop stuff in the chat as well, and or call it out, and we'll keep on plugging in here. So let's talk a little bit more about the eligible uses. So you want to think about these dollars as there's a bucket that's really structured and there's a bucket that's a little bit more flexible. Flexible being those revenue replacement dollars associated with your revenue loss calculation, as we just talked about, broadly used for the provision of government services, and you can use them just simply to fill in budget shortfalls. And the other, I think, really flexible category that is a little bit more nuanced, particularly in the interim final rule, since it's not its own standalone section as some of these other pieces are, is equity-focused services. So the guidance throughout is very intentional to encourage recipients to think about equity, to apply an equity lens, to think about who's getting services, eliminate barriers to folks. And so when thinking about equity focused services, they've sort of also started to break down some of the barriers for how these fiscal recovery funds can be used for the provisions of equity. So they've stated that if you're using the funds in a qualified census tract, then or in other disproportionately impacted area that really can be defined by each individual government themselves, then those dollars are fairly broad in use and could be used for anything associated with infrastructure, as long as you're not using those dollars for things like debt. And funds also can be used to address historic or systemic disparities like health, housing, and education. And so those are your most flexible dollars. When you're thinking about the other uses of funds outside of that provision of government services or that bucket associated with your revenue loss calculation, you can use those dollars for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. You can use them for premium pay for essential workers. You can use them to fund and respond to public health, and you can use them to respond to economic impacts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the responding to public health as well as each of the different of the structured buckets, but I'm going to try to move through these pretty quickly so that I can be responsive to some of the questions in the chat and get into the reporting requirements, which I think is another area of interest that I found, especially since it's most recently just came out. So some of the public health uses and impacts or examples of a public health response include responding to new or heightened public health needs. So this could include COVID-19 testing, enhancement of public health data systems, increasing public health surveillance like monitoring trends, as well as sequencing, public communication efforts. Public health also includes safety measures at key settings like nursing homes, schools, congregate living settings, as well as dense work sites, capital investment in public facilities to meet pandemic operational needs. And so I've seen a lot of this, particularly when folks are thinking about public safety and, whether it's a county jail or, local entities that have had, issues creating social distancing spaces for folks. These funds could be used there, along with using them for vaccination, monitoring the spread of COVID-19 and its variants, as well as medical services for individuals with long COVID that will, likely continue to be developed and made more clear over the next couple of years as we begin to understand more around what those long-term symptoms are. Folks can use them around medical expenses, behavioral health care. You can use them to fund public health and safety staff. So for folks who have, there's a lot of provisions within the interim final rule to, noting the fact that certain sectors have had a disproportionate impact in terms of responding and being responsive to COVID-19. And so there's certainly a sense of dollars associated with those. On the economic impact side, you want to think about these uses as being designed to address economic harm resulting from public health emergency, and assessing the extent at which there was an economic harm, the loss of earnings, and the eligible use must also respond to the identified negative public health impact. And these economic impact expenses, cannot be used, either be immediate or delayed, excuse me, for businesses that did not experience the negative impacts of COVID-19 or that bear no relation to the grossly disproportionate to the type or extent of harm experienced would not be eligible uses. So thinking about the economic impacts, there's a lot of information on these slides, and I see a bunch of questions popping up in the chat. And so we're going to circulate these for you, but there's a lot in here around things you can be doing, from food assistance programs to creating a cash transfer program to job training, assisting unemployed workers, going in further into thinking about small business and nonprofit relief, rehiring staff, and providing aid to impacted industries, tourism being one of those that could be an identified body. And so this disproportionate impacted communities piece is, we talked about it just briefly, is throughout the guidance. And this is how you want to sort of think about a disproportionately impacted community could mean a qualified census tract. Treasury tried to make it very easy and having some delineation of areas where you could immediately get into work that would fulfill that sort of population. But you could also thinking about the municipality could set a disproportionately impacted population either by their mayor,
This meeting is
manager,
being recorded.
or a major government official could sort of set what that disproportionately impacted community is, and then begin doing work and using the funds to address impacts in that community. So other eligible uses for the disproportionately impact include health and social services, as well as housing insecurity, folks that lack affordable housing, as well as homelessness, as well as thinking about specific things relating to education or childhood welfare. And so I'll pause here for a second, because one thing I didn't note explicitly earlier in the presentation is that while the funds are coming to the municipality themselves, these funds can also be used or, passed on to a nonprofit organization or another community organization or group who can actually help to use these funds and to facilitate some of these efforts. So there doesn't necessarily need to be these programs housed at the city level. The city or municipality could serve as a funder to other organizations in order to, make an impact in these particular areas and areas throughout the guidance. Why don't I pause here just briefly?
Yeah, Diane, I think this would be a good place to stop. And we have 4 very good, insightful questions in the chat. I think this would be a good spot to address those 4 questions. Either you or Ryan maybe could take a stab at each one of those.
Totally. I'll start with let me start with the question around later year revenue associated either by a faster rebound. So the question is, if the calculations in a later year show a faster than expected rebound in revenue, would money already spent have to be reallocated or refunded? That's a great question. I think the answer technically is yes. You want to make sure there's a strict limit on the amount of dollars you can use towards the provision of government services associated with your revenue loss calculation. So in the out years, if you did find that the economy rebounded leaps and bounds beyond what you had projected or what you anticipated, then there would be an issue around how those dollars are spent. What I'm recommending for my clients as they're thinking about plugging in and thinking about the expenditures for their fiscal recovery funds, particularly at the revenue loss and revenue replacement dollars, is to have sort of a column around dual impacts. So identifying what uses fall well within the government services, but also sort of tagging those and knowing if they fall into another eligible category as well, just in case you do have to circle back in 2023 or 2024 and realize that you have to bring down your revenue loss, revenue replacement allocation and move those dollars into other uses. It gives you a little bit of cover, and it allows you to know, A, that you're using the funds for eligible uses, but B, it sort of provides a plan B in the event you're not able to fully leverage those dollars in the most flexible funding source. The other thing to think about, and we talked about this a little bit on the equity side, is that the equity dollars are another place that are very flexible. So if you're doing provision of government services and can apply an equity lens to them or demonstrate that they're serving a population or a community that's been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, then I think that's another way to sort of double check yourself that those funds, you're not going to have to go through a heavy exercise of having to reallocate funds after the fact. Another question, you can use revenue loss. Sorry, y'all. I'm reading questions as well as
Danielle, I can read the question out loud and give you time to think about an answer. How about that?
I was just going to do that.
So question number 2 is, My understanding is that you can use the revenue loss for the first year, but you do not have to continue to use it in future years. In other words, you do not have to reevaluate revenue every year. You can choose to use the excess ARPA funds for other reasons. Is this your understanding?
So technically, yes, you can choose. You could choose to not use any of your dollars for revenue replacement if you decided you didn't want to be bothered with the calculation. I would not recommend that. Or decided that it was fine for the first year, but I don't have a significant budget deficit, and I would rather allocate those funds strictly for broadband infrastructure, and that's where I want to spend my dollars, and it has nothing to do with revenue loss replacement. That is allowable. However, I would still recommend doing the revenue replacement calculation because it gives you the most flexibility in using those dollars. But technically, you're correct. You don't necessarily have to. I would have to circle back in the compliance because I believe for the quarterly reports as well as the annual reporting, you have to input the revenue loss calculation anyway, depending on the size of your municipality. So technically in the interim final rule, that is correct, but I would double check that there's not, that the compliance rule and the reporting requirements also equally align to that, so that you're not in a position where you have intentionally decided to not do the revenue loss replacement calculation or not use dollars for revenue loss, but still actually have to do and report on what the revenue loss is anyway. That would sort of be my recommendation there.
All right, Danielle, this is a tricky one. Please discuss interest earned on utility funds, since utility fund revenue should be excluded from the definition of general revenue. And the implication is interest earnings, generally speaking, are included in the revenue calculation. So how does that apply here?
Right. So the utility one is a tricky item that municipalities across the country are, still trying to get guidance on. I know our good friends at GFOA, we've been going back and forth with them. I was on a call with someone who said, I just left a meeting with the White House just about the utility question. So it is, you are not alone. I have a client in Texas who gets a very large transfer from their utility as a payment in lieu of taxes as a pilot. And, we've gone back and forth around whether to include it or exclude it. This is what I would recommend here. So I would exclude the utilities because it's very clear. So one of the things that's noted as a footnote in the interim final rule, but it's included as a link in the FAQ, is the 2006 classification manual from the Census Bureau that basically breaks down the general revenue definitions in grave detail. And that provides a little bit of clarity, but I think we said in earlier in the presentation, there's not, there are some pieces of this interim final rule that are clunky and that contradict each other. And one of them is the utility revenue and the interest revenue. So theoretically, based on how the interim final rule is, for example, you should be able to include interest earned from a utility as well as a payment in lieu of taxes, because that would be considered an intergovernmental revenue. However, because the guidance has been so explicit around not using utilities, for my clients, we have been excluding it altogether, and I would sort of encourage others to do so. And sort of how we've been approaching the revenue loss calculation is to do a scenario with the utility and a scenario without it, so that you're able to sort of see the range of options. And as more clarity comes out, particularly around utilities, that you're able to sort of immediately plug in your updated number based on, better guidance and clarity from Treasury. But it's a great question, and it's one that that's really the one I refresh my screen every couple of hours for on the FAQ to see if they give some guidance on that one. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, Danielle, I think the theory, right, is that future ratepayers are going to have to bear the burden of the loss from the current ratepayers.
Right.
And that's the theory, but the interest earnings one, that's a really interesting spin on it. So, await further guidance, I guess, right? Another question here. If the city put economic relief programs in place and spent funds in late 2020 and early 2021, are those programs eligible for reimbursement, assuming, of course, that they were not funded by CARES, et cetera? Are we going to run into the trick here of the March eligibility window from this year?
Yeah, so if they have to be, you cannot use funds until starting March 3rd. So theoretically, if it by early 2021, you mean before March 3rd, then the answer would be no. But if the program has, outward costs that goes throughout their entire fiscal year, then the answer is yes, you could use the fiscal recovery funds starting on March 3rd for those programs, but not for costs associated prior to that date. And we've also got a couple of questions, not from this group, but just in general around this question of whether you could supplant budget dollars and funds. And the answer is the funds have, yes, March 3rd, 2021 is the start date when you can start spending based on your fiscal recovery allocation. So theoretically, if you had a budget item that was set for that year, you've already spent a half year worth of funding for that program. The second half of the year, you could use the fiscal recovery funds to pay for that program, even if you'd already set aside general fund dollars or another program dollars as a revenue source for that.
All right.
Okay.
I think sorry, Steve, that clears the
No,
chat
let's
for
go.
now. But
Yes.
yeah, encourage folks to continue to ask questions, and we'll we'll have Danielle answer them later on in the presentation.
Awesome.
All right, let's move on to the premiums.
Yep. So I'll talk a little bit about premium pay, and like I said, I'm gonna push through these slides, hustle through them pretty quickly. But the gist is that you can use fiscal recovery funds for premium pay, and to pay premium pay back for eligible workers who were deemed essential and critical to the COVID-19. So this includes healthcare, public health and safety, education folks, sanitation, food production and services. And this is another one where this premium pay could be provided to grocery store workers and other sectors and workers outside of the city or of a municipality. So grocery store workers, home health and retirement home eligible workers also sort of fall into that category. And premium pay by the IFR is defined as a $13 per hour in addition to wages. And there's a lot more detail there, but the thing to note is that folks who worked remote or did telework are not eligible for premium pay under the interim final rule. Let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. So the fiscal recovery funds, there are sort of three categories that have been outlined under the infrastructure piece outside of the governmental services, which has a much broader infrastructure allowable uses around infrastructure. But if you're looking at sort of just the big buckets we were talking about earlier, you can use those dollars for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And on the broadband side, this is really around setting standards to get communities up around necessary broadband and infrastructure speeds, as well as creating, a sufficient way for users to be able to interact with the internet from their own households. And so there's sort of a lot of detail around a minimum of download and upload speeds when you're doing this type of broadband work. But it's a key one. And I'll note for the infrastructure buckets in particular that there's, I'm sure as we all know, there's a very ominous cloud of a potential infrastructure bill, as well as a whole list of other, federal funding sources that are already allowable under the American Rescue Plan associated with infrastructure, broadband being one in particular, that you would want to be really thoughtful around making sure that you're maximizing sort of the other federal funding sources and using the fiscal recovery dollars in the way that's going to maximize them in the most intentional way. So on the water and sewer side, they sort of outline sort of this clean water state revolving fund, as well as the drinking state revolving fund, and have sort of aligned the guidelines around the uses for water and sewer infrastructure to the EPA. And so there's sort of 11 projects that are eligible under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, as well as another 6 under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And I'm gonna push past these because they get a little in the weeds, but just know that that detail is there when you go back into the weeds of it, but that all of these infrastructure uses are sort of intended to, with a focus on, bridging access to folks who theoretically have not seen access before, and is a great way to sort of think about how you can leverage some of the infrastructure work. So some of the ineligible uses that would not be eligible under the fiscal recovery funds, and Ryan touched on these earlier, is that deposit into any pension fund is considered ineligible, as well as tax revenue offset provision. Those two are very big pieces around that you cannot do, and there's multiple sections in the reporting requirements around demonstrating that you have not used your fiscal recovery funds for the offset of the tax provision in particular. So I'm going to talk around the compliance and reporting requirements. So actually in June, so about a week or two ago, Treasury released the guidance and on recipient compliance and reporting requirements. And this chart is pulled straight out of that document, and it sort of outlines the three major reporting requirements associated with the interim final rule, as well as deadlines for those major guides. And so as you're thinking about where your municipality falls, if you are a municipality of 250,000 or more, or a metropolitan city or county, you have a pretty robust reporting schedule that you have to follow, starting with your first one being October 31, and with the second follow in October 31st. For any use, your main reporting deadline is this October 31st, and then about a year afterwards from that point on. And so in that interim report, it's a one-time report, and that's really an overview of the uses of the funds. And so from states and municipalities who have that, you're going to have to provide expenditure category data and summarize sort of what you use and how you use the funds from the date of award to June 30th, 2021. And then thereafter, you would sort of follow this annual basis. For the project and expenditure report, these are one of the recurring reports, and that are submitted on all projects over 50,000, and you would submit those regularly until the end of the 2026 spend end of the fiscal recovery funds. And there's a lot of data that have to go in there, including requiring to submit financial data, information on your revenue loss calculation, information on the contracts that you've used and how those funds are being used. And then I'm going to put some emphasis and shed some light on this recovery plan report, because this report in particular is interesting because Treasury has a lot of guidance around what needs to be in this report, particularly relating to equity. So the recovery plan performance report provides information on projects that large recipients are undertaking with program funding and how they plan to ensure program outcomes are achieved effective, efficient, and in an equitable manner. And so it includes key performance indicators identified by the recipient, as well as some mandatory indicators identified by Treasury. And so a couple of items to note about this plan in particular: it's got to include detail on the intended and actual uses of the funds, along with your jurisdiction's approach to how they help and support a strong and equitable recovery from the economic downturn associated with COVID-19. It requires that you describe strategies employed to maximize the programmatic impact, as well as equitable outcomes, as well as describing how you're using funds to promote equitable outcomes. So it wants you to list out your goals, how aware you are of what the equitable needs are within your community are, how you've addressed access and distribution, and what those outcomes are focused on closing gaps and reaching universal levels of service. And so it also asks you to describe how your jurisdiction's planning current funds prioritizes economic and racial equity as a goal, and then name specific targets intended to produce meaningful equity results. It outlines provisions around how you need to engage the community with how your funds need to be used. So Treasury is pretty clear that each jurisdiction should note how planned or current uses incorporates written, oral, and other forms of input that capture diverse feedback from constituents as well as their community-based organizations. And the plan also includes requirements to report on labor practices and how funds are being used for evidence-based interventions, as well as outline a number of data required and programmatic indicators and program data. So there's a lot of stuff in that compliance and reporting that I would encourage folks to go through. It's organized by your type of municipality, which is helpful. So you should be able to dig in pretty well there. And I see a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah, Danielle, do you want to address these couple before you go into your next section? So I had said earlier in the presentation that non-entitlement cities are reliant on the state of Florida to disperse their funds. Do we have any idea when distribution will occur, and have any Florida metropolitan cities received funds? I believe the answer to the last question is yes. Large cities and counties got their first tranche of funding back in May. But do we have any clarity on when the other folks might see their first dollars?
It's a great question. So you're totally right on the second part, Ryan, that the large municipalities have already received their first tranche. I haven't double checked, so I'd have to circle back and take a look at what the where the state is in their timing. But there actually was an FAQ specifically for non-entitlement units that has a lot of clarity, and I believe has links to each of their individual states where you can sort of see when your state is supposed to receive the funding from the federal government, and therefore you could do the math. And while we're sitting here, perhaps when Ryan is doing closing remarks, I'll try to find that and drop it in the chat so that you can see it, because I think that document probably has the level of detail you're looking and probably has a good answer to that question.
Great. So the compliance and reporting guide issued on June 17th refers to a user's guide. Do you know when that user's guide will be available?
That is a great question. I do not know when the user's guide will be available. I wish. Just keep hitting refresh on your FAQ like me. We can all hit refresh at the same time to see what comes out of that one.
All right. And large cities are populations over 50,000 or over 250,000. And maybe I shouldn't, advance an answer here. I should leave it to the expert, Danielle. But I believe that large cities are defined at 50,000 and counties are defined at over 250,000. So both numbers are relevant here. Is that right, Danielle?
I think that's right.
Okay, keep them coming. We'll let Danielle keep going, but any other stumpers, and I'll pose them to her at the end.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone, for your questions so far. So our last main section before we start thinking about bringing all of these pieces together is this equity considerations part, because it has, if you've read, all 151 pages of the interim final rule, God bless you, then I would say you've seen it throughout every section. Wherever they can put it, it's this word encourage for equity, or recommend using this equity, or framing it around equity. And we've already talked about how they've gone so far as to make equity related uses super broad and super open for how you use those dollars. And so a lot of that is because of how COVID-19 impacted certain populations more than others. So the death rate for Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans has been nearly 3 times the death rate of white Americans, according to the CDC. About 9.9% of Black workers, 9.3% of Latino workers nationwide were unemployed at year end 2020, compared to 6% of white workers. And during the first months of the pandemic, Black-owned businesses shuttered at a higher rate than white-owned businesses, 41 versus 17%. And so, across the public sector, the COVID-19 recession has opened up severe budget gaps and key pressures of the economy, but those impacts sort of are exacerbated when you add, any number of equity lens on top of that, whether that be income or educational attainment or, your race or gender. And vaccination, while is bringing us a little bit closer to return to normal, also has, there's a real equity component around how folks get access and how we as, folks who are excited and committed to the public sector eliminate barriers where we can. So when you think about sort of equity and service delivery, you want to think about making sure that it's applied at this place-based level. And doing so sort of allows governments to target resources that reflect the new post-COVID-19 economy while also addressing very unique racial, geographic, and educational disparities. So every municipality is different. You all have your very different demographic makeups and needs and challenges. And so figuring out what those are and sort of targeting resources to address those populations that makes the most sense for your communities is, I think, really what the guidance is getting at. And so I really like this sort of, I've seen a lot of equity versus equality slides, but this one I really like because, you know, it's sort of identifying and breaking out resources, not equally, but so that the folks who everyone has access or the same level of access to those community resources. So we have a couple of different definitions there, but it's certainly just a lens you want to start thinking about, particularly because the guidance as well as the reporting have a lot of questions related to how you're thinking about equity, how equity is applied, and to one of the earlier great questions we had around, you know, well, what if my revenue replacement dollars comes in lower at any given point? The equity piece and the equity framework is a great way to allow you to sort of push forward and continue to apply dollars in a really flexible way. So a couple of things about equity and budgeting. You want to think about keeping a note that budgeting for equity is not anti-growth. It's not a zero-sum game, meaning that equitable outcomes can provide a higher quality of life and healthier communities for everyone. And it's not just about race. While race matters, there are many equity dimensions that vary across community. Some of them listed here, but also thinking about disability and access. And so as a best practice, GFOA nationally recommends tying budget planning to an overall strategic plan, and, you know, layering an equity lens to that should be a key goal and is sort of not only highly encouraged for the governmental service funds, but for most of the other funds in the ARP are sort of requirements as you think about how you're going to be applying those dollars and who's benefiting and how you're eliminating barriers for those in your services that you're offering. So eliminating barriers to access, some of these potential barriers are sort of listed there on the right. But some of these questions you may want to think about as you're creating your programs and figuring out how your dollars are going to be spent is, how does the proposed infrastructure expand opportunity and access for individuals to the needed government services? What's the potential for reduced access to services? And so as you're thinking about, and this was particularly important during the pandemic when, you know, we were forced with having significant reductions in revenue, particularly in Florida, given our tourism industry, same in Louisiana, here in New Orleans, you know, how do we make sure that the services that we have to cut or bring down are not disproportionately impacting, you know, one particular group? And where is the service delivered and to whom? So these are just some initial questions you can think about. And the February, actually, GFR article that GFOA puts out was based in equity and had a sort of an equity framework throughout. And so that one would be a good one if you're trying to scale up and sort of get a little bit of sense on how you can address these issues. I thought that GFOA resource was a good one, and PFM put an article in there around doing equity related to capital. So some tools you can have in your equity budgeting toolkit. Having a multi-year financial plan is key. Doing this goal setting and as well as outcome-based budgeting, creating equity guidelines for your budget development process, thinking about how you're leveraging and maximizing minority and women-owned businesses, and community benefit agreements, and then analysis and review tools, thinking about a tax revenue evaluation impact or a tax burden analysis, looking at sort of past patterns and trends, and then thinking about, you know, this triple bottom line of economic, who's benefiting economically, who's benefiting fiscally, and who's benefiting socially, and what are the impacts we're trying to have there, as well as who's doing the work, as well as, you know, getting to provide these services on your behalf. And there's some guidance and language encouraging sort of a diverse representation of folks at the labor level within the interim final rule as well. So I'll pause again before I let Ryan bring it all back together. And we'll have another spot for questions at the very end. But if folks have anything, feel free to come off mute or to drop it in the chat and be happy to address it.
Yeah, Danielle, before you bring it all together, we do have one question here. What if you are a large city and have not received funds? And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that all large local governments that are getting a direct allocation actually need to request the funds through the Treasury portal. So if you have not received funds, I'm speculating here, it's possible that the funds were not requested at sort of the first opportunity when the portal opened, and we might have missed that initial disbursement window. Is that what you think might be the case, Danielle?
Yeah, that could be it. I would, if you have not requested the funds, then that's probably the issue. But I would reach out to Treasury. I know they're working overtime to be super responsive to folks, but and if that's not the case and you have requested the funds, I would probably still reach out to Treasury because Ryan is exactly right. The first tranche of funds for large municipalities has happened already or has been dispersed.
All right, I think that is all the questions so far, but
Back
we'll have
to
an
Ryan.
opportunity.
He's going to take us home.
Bring it all together.
I'll bring it all. All right, we can go to the next slide. So there were a lot of slides in this presentation and a lot of words on each slide, but there are some key takeaways. This is an unprecedented opportunity for local governments. There has not been direct federal relief of this magnitude in our nation's history. It's hard to contemplate something in the future that would result in direct allocations of this magnitude. So it's both a challenge, right, for all of the issues Danielle discussed. We have to do calculations, we have to do reporting, we have to obligate funds, we have to spend funds. But it is really an opportunity, right? This is your chance. This is local government's chance to be able to do the types of projects and the types of sort of staff augmentation and other types of things that folks have been wanting to do. There is a path here using these dollars to be able to do a lot of these things. It's not just about, though, sort of what local governments are doing. It's completely changed the macroeconomy. It's changed consumer behavior. It's changed business behavior. It's changed where and how we work. I alluded to it earlier that sort of commercial downtowns are really struggling right now. It's unclear to what extent they will be coming back. I can speak for PFM. We are moving to a hybrid in-person and remote work environment, and likely won't need as much office space for our own firm. And so that's just one example, but that's really applying to basically all types of businesses. And so governments need to be prepared to how to align sort of current past needs and future needs, which might differ from each other in terms of, just location of public safety services or location of future growth. The pandemic has had varying levels of impact, right? So not everybody has been affected the same way. And that's kind of the theory behind the calculations that the federal government is sort of imposing. It's not a flat dollar amount. There's a lot of disparate impacts across regions of the country and even within counties, right? Even within Palm Beach County. As I said, we're based out of New Orleans. Tourism industry was really hard hit. That also applies to pretty much the entire state of Florida. So it's important, it's a good thing that the federal government has incorporated some things such as unemployment rate and has designed these calculations to get the money to where it is needed most. And as I said, it's important to target resources where they're needed. Danielle talked a little bit about the equity component of this legislation and how it's important to make sure that we're not just complying with that, but also targeting the communities where these resources might be needed and supporting small businesses, right? Because small businesses are really going to be the backbone of a long-term recovery. All right, so there's a multi-year plan framework to this, right, that Danielle mentioned a number of times. You need to evaluate your needs first, You need to kind of figure out what resources you're getting and what your needs are, right? That's the baseline of any type of analysis, and also assess your longer term needs. And then you need to develop goals and options. Could range, from, a single person in a room deciding how all of these allocations are going to be handled, or probably ideally a collaborative enterprise between multiple areas of a local government and even folks outside the government in terms of sort of getting community input or stakeholder input on how to restore services and make strategic investments. And then you need to execute. So you need to prioritize. Danielle referred to a menu of options. You just kind of come up with your list of potential options and prioritize them, and then communicate that multi-year plan. You're not required to obligate the funds until a few years from now, but in order to do that, you need to plan now and make sure that everybody is on the same page about where these funds are going to go. And then there's always, just as Treasury is constantly reevaluating and revising their own guidance, there will be an opportunity for local governments to reevaluate and revise their plans over the next couple of years. So there's an immediate aspect to this response, right, which is public health and economic relief and recovery. This is a response to sort of the acute nature of the economic impacts from the recession. So that's first, and that's really why sort of the broadest category of funding is allocated towards public health and economic relief, because there's a recognition that that is sort of the highest need right now. But again, using a multi-year framework, you want to be able to develop a strategy that will set yourself up for the long term, and that's related to sustainable fiscal health. You want to make sure that your revenues and expenses are aligned. This is an opportunity to do that. Make sure you're evaluating and shooting for future economic growth. Make sure you have the right capital and infrastructure investments. Water, sewer, and broadband are included in the legislation, but there's a lot of other things that can be done just to set yourself up for the future. And then, of course, equity and inclusion. You want to make sure that, again, you're not just complying with the requirements of the legislation, which requires sort of considering these factors in certain areas, but also just to make sure that you're using these funds to help as many people as possible in your local community. This slide is a doozy. So there are multiple funding streams that are part of this legislation. So we had those colors earlier, right, of all the different blocks of funding and their relative magnitudes. But the point here is there's $350 billion for the state and local fiscal recovery funds, and that is just a small part of a $2 trillion legislative package. Now, a lot of that money has gone out the door already in terms of direct assistance, stimulus checks, unemployment insurance, but a lot of it hasn't. It's in other buckets. There's other targeted aid. There's other public sector aid, particularly in education. And again, I mentioned sort of the direct aid to individuals and families. And there's also an opportunity to help small businesses in your area. I mean, I think that's why the collaborative approach is necessary. Leveraging, everybody's familiar with the concept of being able to leverage funds to get, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so if there are additional dollars flowing into your communities that are outside the direct state and local aid, it's important to understand what those are and be able to collaborate on their use, because that'll ultimately lead to the best result. In order to do so, there are potential strategies for alignment across stakeholders. You can convene coordination groups. You should certainly talk to your other local government partners, within the county or even across county lines. Nonprofit institutions and community organizations should definitely have a voice in this process. Incentives for coordinated planning. You want to coordinate your approaches. If you could encourage sort of your next step up, whether it's the county government or beyond, to host some of this or to convene some of this to make sure everybody's on the same page. And you can even form formal interlocal agreements with other local governments to distribute funds. There's nothing in the legislation or the rules that prevents formal partnerships between local governments, as long as you manage your own reporting. Or you could use a nonprofit structure where you funnel some of these funds through local partners to have them provide services directly. As Danielle said way back in the beginning of the presentation, this is supposed to be a win-win, right? So while there is the burden of the reporting requirements and the calculations and everything else, this is really a historic opportunity. So as we said, multi-year planning is the best tool that can be employed to make sure that these funds provide the maximum benefit. If you already have a multi-year plan, now is the time to update it, because unless you had a crystal ball, you probably did not predict an influx of funding directly from the federal government, which is pretty unprecedented. If you don't have a multi-year plan, this is the time to create one, because so often local governments are scrambling to create a multi-year plan when they're staring down the barrel of a recession. And what are we going to do if we have sort of ever-escalating losses of revenue over a period of time? This is an opportunity to plan for the use of additional dollars. So this is a happier multi-year planning framework than what we would have encountered before or during the pandemic. There's a bunch of different things that you need to do in order to sort of enhance that approach. You need to do economic and revenue forecasting, tax policy analysis. What are your county and state governments doing? Evaluate your tax incentives. You want to develop a framework so you can maximize your benefits. I've talked about real estate a number of times. That's really important. It's such a huge driver for many local governments. It's important to know what your local real estate market is doing. Again, equity impact analysis, making sure that the dollars are going where they're most needed, and standing up small businesses and providing them support so that they can help your economy recover. Reach the end. There we go.
All right. Thank you very much, Ryan and Diane. Well, I think we are at the end. If there's any additional questions, I believe we got all the questions answered in the chat. And we think we still have some more time if anybody has any additional questions, or if there's any questions from the audience.
Any questions?
Nicely done. Thank you for the presentation. Great information. Sorry, I typed fast. I put quite a few of the questions in there. Sorry.
Great job, Linda.
Okay. Sorry.
Anybody else? Oh, we do have another question in the chat box. Ryan, if you want to take the lead on that one.
Sure. So one of the later slides mentioned doing stormwater and street work. Is this under the equity category, since it is not listed in the infrastructure section, water and sewer and broadband only? So Danielle, I know that the stormwater question, just like pretty much every other utility related question, has been sort of the bane of the existence of folks who are trying to follow this evolving guidance, but I'll let you take a shot.
Yeah, no, it has been. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for the question. It has been. I think most people would say that stormwater will be included with the water category so that you would be fine. Street work, however, is not associated, correct, within the 4 infrastructure categories that we had talked about. It is allowable under the provision of government services. So whatever you find under the allocation of dollars from your revenue loss calculation could be used for street work, or you could do street work in a qualified census tract, or you could do street work for the provision of helping a disproportionate impact community. So if it's you're needing to build a health clinic because you want to address, high levels of cholesterol and diabetes and heart problems in a particular neighborhood, then theoretically, the infrastructure associated with that program in that particular neighborhood would be allowable. But you're absolutely right that the road infrastructure in particular, unless it's associated with, because you've ripped up your sewer or the water or the broadband, the ground in order to put those things in there is not an allowable cost. Ryan, anything you want to add there?
No, I think that covered it. I think you said it quickly there, but I think the intention and many folks are seeking clarification that stormwater and drainage work is the hope is that it will be considered water infrastructure. It's not 100% clear yet, but yes, street work is in a different category.
Thank you for the question. Any others?
All right, I don't think I hear any other questions, and I'll turn it back to our hosts at Riviera Beach. And I want to thank all of you for inviting us. And I want to say to Randy, we got through it all.
All right. Well, certainly thank you to the team from PFM. We will be sharing the entire video production as well as the slides with you. We will send them to Mr. Sherman, and he'll get it out to the finance directors. And then I will share it with the managers group as well, so we can get that information distributed. But thank you all for coming here today, and thank you for joining us for this comprehensive discussion on something that's very important to each and every one of our communities. So thank you again, and have a great 4th of July weekend, and we'll see you soon.